So I'd like you to be thinking about a topic, broad in nature or quite narrow in focus, because we can narrow broad things and we can expand narrow things, just to move discussion into domains that you are interested in and hope the collectivity of this group would find interesting. And so be thinking, just have a subject if you're called on, okay? And as a matter of fact, then I'll start just picking out someone I'm confident will speak, have something to speak to, and ask you to lead off. Diane, would you?
I will. Thank you. We've been talking about the Anthropocene. And
About the what?
The Anthropocene and anthropocentric views of the world and which direction it's going.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the subject of human population and if conservationists would see any value in setting some sort of human population goal and if that would be different. Because even with the Anthropocene worldview, there's still a limit to the number of humans that the world can accommodate. And we haven't broached that subject yet.
No, I haven't. I'm prepared to, but I'd like to hear first from anyone else who'd like to address this subject.
I can say just one thing I witnessed this summer. I worked in southwestern Uganda this summer doing field research with an organization that does family planning as part of conservation education. But it's framed in this way that I think ties into a lot of what we're talking about of convincing human beings it's in their self-interest, and underneath that is conservation benefits. So they were doing outreach in many villages, both to men and women, but separately, about the benefits of smaller number of children in their self-interests. And then when they'd done all that workshop, then they would talk about how it would benefit conservation as well. So part of my research was asking people if they felt there was a link between, first asking them how they had benefited from family planning, and what they had learned, what they had integrated, and then underneath that asking if they felt there was a connection between family planning and conservation. And most people answered in a way that would make sense to us. But it's framed first in an anthropogenic view of like
working.
And has it changed family sizes?
I mean, it hasn't even been one full generation that they've done this training. They just started, so it's hard to know if it's actually going to be successful. But like thinking in developing countries, how to balance that, because I think about that a lot too. So that's just one thing I saw.
I agree with Alex. I think the anthropocentric view in this case goes well with the conservation view, because family planning and education and raising the poverty line, all those things reduce human population just because people are having fewer kids. So I think those benefit people and conservation. That's one case where I think the goals are pretty well aligned.
That's probably right. Please.
So I would just throw out, I think the big question is who gets to decide whose population, and so even if it's like sort of in the interest of the biosphere and the interest of the environment, I think the big question is, okay, so we agree maybe population growth is problematic, but then who gets to decide which population is suddenly going to be reduced and by how much? And so there's no question, I think, that there's self-interest among populations, for example, who don't have access to family planning, who might want it, who would have smaller families by their own choice if they were then to be able to make those choices. But at the same time, we've seen in the world the experience of governments deciding first who gets to have and who doesn't get to have. And so I think this very much becomes a massive policy and political question, irrespective of whether or not there's a quote unquote value. I think there's an underlying issue of who gets to decide, and then how do you implement that kind of policy.
Very much a political issue.
What if we're already way over that level that's sustainable?
Wait, let's get another voice going here.
I was going to say, maybe this is a naive view, but I think if you look around most of the world, in the developed countries and the educated ones, birth rates have declined dramatically over the past 40 years. And maybe this is kind of skirting the moral question of the issue, but I think One of the main goals that we need to have is education of women, because that has a huge impact on family size. And yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. It's, how do you tell someone they can't have kids? How do you tell them that this is the number you have? You're going to meet a lot of resistance from that. But I think that there's a lot of other ways you can accomplish it that aren't maybe like a direct command line view. So I think that hopefully with some of these goals, it's kind of a problem that'll take care of itself a little bit. But you do raise a good question of, have you already stepped over that bound? And I would kind of counter that. I think the population is one part of it, but I think if you keep going down that, you really have to ask, is growth sustainable? Is growth even possible? Is the idea of sustainable development a misnomer? And that's where I would say I direct my more line of questioning, but I don't want to get away from that.
I think it's time for some facts to be introduced, and that is the following. Population is now at 7 billion. The break-even point for zero population growth is 2.1 child per woman. The populations of the world are dropping rapidly, and in all developed countries are below 2.1. That includes native-born Americans. It's dropping on every continent, very slowly in Africa, and if at all in the Middle East. United Nations population analysts project that at the rate that it's dropping worldwide, we will reach a peak of about 9 to 10 billion people by the end of the century, and then it will continue to drop. Apparently, this is, as you just said, something intrinsic that by a great stroke of some kind of cosmic luck, we may avoid a problem that seemed for a long while as insoluble, that we would be bacteria, we would be lemmings. We could not stop ourselves because of our endless fascination with sex and children, but that is not true. It turns out that women, in every case where women get substantial freedom, particularly economic freedom, it plunges. Where population remains at very high levels, very discouragingly, are some of the Arab countries and desert countries of the Middle East. And I'm reminded of the old Tuareg, to explain this, of the old Tuareg saying, the Tuaregs are the ones causing all that trouble in Libya. And it is these desert people, they have a saying, kiss the hand you cannot sever. Well, with this kind of attitude, everything centers on the family and the little tribal unit. And there is, if you will, discuss this, as people like Tom Friedman do regularly, with the local people in Arab countries that are still at a relatively low state of advance, toward developed status. They will tell you, we have lots of children because we have no other protection. And so we have to build up a family. This used to be true also very much of Asia. But we need all these people around us dedicated to us, our children, to take care of us in our old age and each other. So we need to create a little mini tribe of our own. But that's vanishing fast. And I think the peak at 9 to 10 billion may be manageable. That's 40% more than what we have now. We got to learn how to feed them. And we hope that they will settle down in countries like Uganda. And again, Uganda could also start by not executing gays, but then moving on, to accepting a low birth rate. I don't want to cut the conversation off, but I'd like to go on to another subject. So any one of you pick up on me here. Go on. What do you want to talk about? It can be far afield. It can be political, anything.
But maybe a step removed from the population. The goal of reducing the population is not solely to reduce the population, but it's to increase the space and increase the available resources. So it's more of a means, really, than.
Will you tell us something about the ecological footprint? Expanding on that issue, or would you know about the ecological footprint, and could you tell us anything
of
about
each person? Well, we use too much. I mean, so one of
What?
what JP brought up as a way to reduce the population is provide education and economic incentives. The problem with doing that, I mean, so there's a huge movement to help communities develop, and in doing so, reduce the growth rate. But if you look at a country like the U.S., which is growing very slowly, if at all, we would be a reason not to, because if every country was like the U.S. and didn't have a growing population, but it takes a certain amount of consumption to get where we are in terms of simple population growth, that wouldn't be a good thing.
Yeah.
So the conservation goals that we face are symptoms of something, and it's easy to view population as the cause, and I certainly do, but population is the cause of something else, which is in fact causing the conservation issues. So there's a discrepancy there, an important distinction in kind of causation.
Yeah, well, you're right on target with reference to one thing, and that is the great golem, the great monster and devourer of Earth that looms beyond mere population growth is per capita consumption.
Yep.
That's basically what it is.
Yep.
Are you all familiar with the estimate that in order for everyone on Earth to enjoy a U.S. standard of living would require 3 more planet Earths?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Have you got any commentary on that? I mean, what's going to happen? Wait a minute. Okay, we're back to you, and then
Well, I
let's
just want
pass.
to speak on behalf of the developing countries, since I am from one. It feels like they always blame the developing countries because of population, but then again, we produce the least amount of carbon, and we also have like all the forests that soak up everything and that like let the world kind of continue. So it is a big political issue. Like, should we just like tell people in Africa or South America and Asia to like stop having children? Well, people in the U.S. or Europe like keep their children and can live with like a car each. So
Yeah. Would you recommend a solution, ma'am?
I would recommend.
Okay, wait just a minute. Go on. What's your solution? It's got to be a global solution and very much a U.S. and Western European solution.
I think economy is like global now, but how we use our resources is not being managed in a global way. People use resources in one way, and like the people in like say Europe don't have to worry about where their resources come from, but they don't know where they come from. So like the economy moves in a global way, but people don't understand where resources are coming from. And people that produce the resources probably don't know that they're the ones that can keep the world going around. So if everyone understood like what they're spending, where it comes from, and what people are being affected by that, maybe that would create a different way of consumption.
I keep hearing words that's already been raised here. You know, I keep hearing education.
Yeah.
I can't disagree with that.
It's
Who wants to
definitely
pick up on this? Go ahead.
How about technology?
What? Oh, okay. We're back. Okay. All right. We're back to the good Anthropocene and the bad Anthropocene. Have you got anything to take to the United Nations General Assembly this morning?
No, I just think this is another area where we can see a blending of anthropocentric and sort of conservation-minded, because every advance we have in renewable energy technology and all these things that we're using every day, that certainly goes towards conservation goals. It's reducing our consumption. So I think there are ways where this sort of human-centered
Okay, very good.
technologist view can benefit.
Oh, great seer, would you like to tell us what you're going to do about food?
Is there not enough food for, certainly there's enough food for everybody on Earth now. Is there not enough food for the projected 10 billion people?
I would think so.
Yeah, I would think so too.
But I keep hearing the word distribution,
Yeah.
transport, all that. Have you got any ideas on that? In other words, if if the population of Duke or say at least North Carolina would forego one meal and magically transmit it to Darfur and the South Sudan, boy, think about what a difference that would make. But that's magic. And what's the solution to distribution of food and improvement of agriculture?
So isn't that back to education and poverty alleviation?
Okay, well, we want to do more than that. You know, you just brought up technology. I tell you what, anybody got any concrete solutions on producing more food? We got to solve this footprint problem. If you do not know, because I'll add a little facts here, if you do not know what the ecological footprint is, you must. And who know it? Who know about it? You know, okay, I better, this is, the ecological footprint, that's a big idea thinking that fits in this very well. It is the amount of productive land, you can't include the Sahara, most of the Sahara Desert, the amount of productive land that's used by each person in a society, a city, a country, worldwide, whatever unit you want, and how much do you, a single person, you know, an individual person, use up, you know, of arable land, and that includes, of course, real arable land for your food. It includes your water supply. It includes your residents. It includes all your government facilities and the like. It includes your energy sources, the whole thing that keeps you going in the lifestyle you have day by day. Okay, I've forgotten the exact figure for the ecological footprint of a person, but I mean in America, but I think it's about 20 acres, right? What?
I'm okay.
You're okay.
Sorry.
Oh, I
Yes,
thought you
right.
were just about to say, no, it's, all right. I think it's about 20 acres. And the average, I'm a little out of date here, about 5 years, maybe it's changed, but the average in developing country is about 1/10 that. Now, you know what's happening in all these developing countries. They want TV, they want automobiles, they want life like what they see elsewhere. And the question is, can we actually have a world population without technology that goes up to American level? And the answer, I think, is emphatically no. You can get back in the race there.
Okay, thanks. But when you say without technology, I'm not 100% clear what you mean by that. It seems like one minor solution that we could implement would be heavy investment in infrastructure. I mean, issues of distribution are often ultimately logistical problems. Like, what is that? Something about everything coming down to a matter of scheduling, and sometimes getting food efficiently and effectively from place A to place B is just a matter of limitations in roads, limitations in air transport, etc.
Yeah.
So if we could maybe improve our efficiency in terms of infrastructure globally, that would
Very
make a huge
good.
impact.
Someone commented about food recently, op-ed, New York Times. Made it in one phrase. He said, either we increase the productivity of the land we cultivate substantially, or we get new land. And of course, if you take new land, goodbye natural environment, goodbye the rain from the forest, everything, eventually. So clearly, the only solution is, I think you stumbled on this with luck, technology. All right, so we really should be thinking about that good part of the Anthropocene, which is how we're going to settle down without wrecking the planet. And there's so many things we can do. And I don't want to drone on and monopolize it, but I want to hear ideas. And they include dry land agriculture. You're about to see dry land agriculture with perennial crops, deep root crops, and year-round crops that can suffice with the rainfall available after the water tables have dropped below sustainability. And also crops that are more productive than the ones we have, that we use. You know, we're stuck with something like 20 species of crops that we inherited from our Mesopotamian and Mayan ancestors, and we really haven't gotten much beyond that. There are an estimated 50,000 species of plants out of the 375,000 or so known that actually have edible plant parts that could be developed either whole as a crop, a very productive crop, like the magic bean, so-called, of New Guinea, or genes can be taken from them to add things like saline soil resistance capability, of higher yield, of resistance, frost resistance, all these things. All this is technology. This is gene substitute, gene manipulation technology. And that's just the beginning. I think we've really got to get busy. Now I'm talking like an anthropocenist, I realize. But we have to get busy and support and push. What's going to be a big part of the future is developing this particular kind of technology. You know, one more thing, and then I'm going to call on you. I opened this session, this course, with talking about the next big thing in biology, which is synthetic biology. So now let's go back to the dreams of Craig Venter, who's a friend of mine, but he's also an amazing, successful, forward thinker. I know what he's up to. He wants to develop a bacterium, preferably by selective breeding, maybe by gene transfer, but if he has to, he's going to build one, you know, from chemicals off the shelf that can be bred in immense vats that produce as a product these bacteria a fuel or immediate, easy convertible fuel predecessor. So these are among the things that they're dreams now, but they can be made reality. We can produce, it's conceivable that we can produce immense amounts of new energy, not just by capturing solar radiation, but by chemical energy. Now, what you're thinking, of course, all being forward thinkers yourself, you're saying, hold on just a minute. You can have all these photosynthetic organisms, you know, churning away in these big tanks, but remember, they're also using, ultimately, solar energy. Answer, look beneath you in the ground to the chemosynthetic slimes, this immense flora of bacteria, and probably archaea as well, that take energy directly from materials and energy directly from the rocks. So we have a lot of rocks and dirt down 10 feet below, 20 feet below, and so on. We have a potentially an infinite source of energy if we could produce these pools of, and even food. So this is just one path. And I call upon you who would like to go to Silicon Valley or stay in this research triangle and wish to become billionaires to get busy working on these angles. Ma'am.
So I would say the one thing that worries me about technology is that I think there are some people who use it to sort of avoid dealing with the underlying problems by sort of fixing symptoms of climate change as they happen. And I feel like we just need to be careful. I totally agree that a lot of technology can be useful if we're using it with the intent of maybe decreasing what we already have and improving on what we already have, rather than, I guess, trying to avoid problems as false solutions. So I guess over the summer I worked a lot with food and technology, and what I'm thinking of in particular is, for example, there's a new genetically engineered salmon that's being proposed in the US that a lot of people know about, and there's a lot of debate, and I feel like you know, a lot of people say that it's good because we can grow bigger salmon faster, but a lot of environmentalists are worried that they can escape and supplant native populations, which is not great. And on the topic of synthetic biology, there's a big movement to try to get synthetic biology legalized in some places to make synthetic spices, particularly, so vanilla or saffron, which are really expensive and hard to make. But if you make them synthetically, you're gonna displace the jobs of all of these people who it's probably their only high income export. So I just feel like, oh, and not only that, but they need fuel to feed the yeast who are trying to make the vanilla.
Yeah.
So of course they're gonna try to use agricultural waste, which of course just takes nutrients out of the soil again. But the point is, I feel like you need to be careful when you think about technology that you're not just improving one thing while taking away from a lot of other resources that maybe we weren't having the technology for the express purpose of dealing with. But I think that we've done enough sort of plowing forward with technology without thinking about how it's affecting everything around us. And I think that we
Okay.
really need to think
Madam-
before we put more out there.
Madam Secretary, I'm now addressing you as a likely Secretary of the Interior, or and a widely touted presidential candidate for the year 2028. That I'd like to hear just what you want to, how you're going to handle this.
I don't know how I'm going to handle it. I just feel like
Yeah.
if we've gone this far trying to think that technology is going to save everything, and most technology we've put out there has ended up backfiring in the end, that we should just be more careful. Not backfiring, but let me speak more carefully. So I feel like what we do a lot as humans is put things out there and think that it's going to be the next big solution, and then 10 or 20 years later realize all the harm that it did while we were fixing one problem. And I just feel like we need to be a lot more precautionary moving forward, and just maybe try to think less retroactively about.
Okay, I'll just make one comment, and I want to open it further, and that is, once again, we're back to good Anthropocene and bad Anthropocene. And you're describing the dangers of bad Anthropocene. That is when you look at the ultimate black cloak skeleton carrying the scythe for humanity, it's climate change. It's climate warming. I mean, you've got a beautiful exponential curve going up toward 400 parts per billion, and so we're sort of in the position there, aren't we, of a bad Anthropocene would be, okay, I think there's a canyon straight ahead, and we could go right over the edge of it. So put your foot down harder on the accelerator. What you're saying is,
No.
slow down, get out the road map, think out the alternatives and this such. But once again, we've got to, how are we going to do that? We've got to get the American public on board thinking like that. Yeah, wait a minute, let me get around, ma'am.
So I do a lot of research on agriculture, on rural populations in Central America and Mexico, and think a lot about things like biotechnology, and I also would similarly, I'm sensing that your view of food biotechnology is perhaps aligned with the other points that you've been following along. But one of my big concerns is that, again, we view technology as a panacea, and that we sort of don't question the fact that there are interests that stand behind the advocacy of those technologies that are not necessarily in the interest of the populations that they purport to serve. And for example, I think with certain kinds of food biotechnology, they are strongly advocated as solving the problem that we've been talking about, population, who's going to feed the world. When reality is that the bottom billion isn't necessarily going to benefit from that, and that in many cases there's been a lot of evidence that things like agroecology or improving subsistence livelihoods to a higher level with a better integration with local environments and thinking more about local procurement, regional food supplies, as opposed to this sort of top-down massive distribution system that's going to be successful somehow by the benefits of great technology. I think that there's a lot of narrative behind that gets us away from thinking about the fact that, if you actually ask these people, and I work with a lot of folks in Mexico who, they would say, we don't want this necessarily, and if we could have these things, that would actually help us to produce more food, and we could actually serve our local economy better. But that's what's not happening. That there's this real disconnect that does not necessarily have to do with, everybody from the top down promoting one solution, and that's my big concern.
Very good. What I'm hearing from you and a couple of others here is that we really are going to have to go through a process of evolution and by selection, in which efforts are tried and we gain. Some succeed, some don't. Some technology succeeds, some are bad. And that we sort of feel our way along. That's what I think you were trying to say as well. Are you getting satisfied here about technology? That maybe we can feel our way along by stepwise on each case, and maybe education is the solution, so that we have a much more alert population. And by alert population, I'm talking about those who read the New York Times as opposed to USA Today. Who's next?
I just second what's your name?
Shayna.
What Shayna said. I was thinking you keep asking what do you think the solution is, and I have finally come to this one word, which is just diversify. We try to look for one solution for things. We talk about maybe technology, or we have to end world hunger. But all the space that we use for just soy, we could have multi-strata crops that are way more productive, that could feed the people, that are right next to it. So it's a little going back to how people before produce things, or how people in the rural areas that have to feed from their land produce things, and that's sustainable. So someone said it's probably not likely that we can be sustainable at this huge population, but maybe if we look into different ways of producing things and feeding animals without feeding them with corn or with soy, maybe it would be more sustainable. And there are a lot of examples going on with people on the ground that grow this. So just it never gets to the top ones.
How are you going to solve this problem? Without a confederation of corn farmers saying, send that woman back to Colombia.
So I think one of the things I would do is prove with data that these things are more productive.
Yeah.
So the main thing is we all say we should all be sustainable and local, but we don't know how much that costs or how much it's different from corn. So corn produces more, but if a plague comes and they're all the same, we know it just wipes it out. And it's going to happen sometime, like it happened in Ireland with potatoes. And they all had to
absolutely. And how do you do this? But it becomes political, doesn't it? I mean, you're going to have some kind of regulation, whether it's national or whether it's by international, United Nations regulation and so on. I'm going to go on, and maybe I'll pick up on you again. But I just wanted to mention the potato thing. You're dead right about that. We depend on one species of potato off the Andean that the Incas used to have a very rich diet. And I know one day I was at the Department of State, and there was a guy there who had just been investigating the various potato species and varieties in the Andes, and he had plates laid out with slices of all these species, and some of them are absolutely delicious. And it occurred to me that they also are adapted to different conditions, where they are grown they're kept going by small numbers of Andean farmers. But they, all but the Idaho potato is not used, not investigated. If during the Irish potato famine, some little effort had been made to find the resistant strain, even of the Irish potato. And taking it to Ireland, it could have saved millions of lives. And this is the sort of thing I think education again matters. I was going to come back to you, and then we'll head on. Go on. You were going to say.
a very brief point about the trying to get data in response to Natalia. So I would just caution that we actually have a lot more data than we think we do, because frequently the companies who sell the crops that we use in monoculture today are blocking data that says that their crops are worse than, traditionally hybridized plants, including professors at Duke who have been blocked from publishing certain things. So I think that maybe it's not just a matter of data, just as a brief caution. And also thank you to both of you for saying what I was trying to say much more eloquently. It's too early for this.
No. I want to ask a general question of you. I was already mature and full professor at Harvard when we had the great student rebellions of the 60s, during the Vietnam War. Where the heck have you been with reference to these problems we're talking about? Of poverty, of environment, of the great troubles of the world being caused by inequities, about the United States may be in a very difficult bind because of income disparity. Why aren't you on the streets? Nobody can answer that. Okay, that's not a fair question.
No, I think we are on the streets.
You are?
I think so.
I haven't heard any yelling and seen any banners or anything. What?
The Earth Liberation Front. They were around just recently. ELF, the Earth Liberation Front, I believe they were called. It was a very extremist environmentalism that was happening. That occurred.
That worries me.
It was that is a bad. That's not the That's not a good way to go.
I don't want to see DuPont and Monsanto blown up. I just want to see pressure put on them.
And there was just in Raleigh, just locally, this past weekend, there was a big organization of people who rallied in really good ways for social issues, just locally. And,
social or environmental?
A little bit of both. I think they both feed to each other. And there's actually going to be, I think from this, there's going to be a talk from our governor at 10:30 this morning speaking on education. Education in our state to the public school systems have been, a lot of change has happened in a lot of bad ways. And
we've been reading about North Carolina.
Yeah, and so there has been people on the streets.
Okay, good. Well,
So,
I'm glad to hear that. What you need, as your generation needs, is to assemble a kind of guidebook, or just a basic body of knowledge about what the key problems are, which ones are soluble, which immediately soluble, which ones really require a lot more research, and so on. In order to take that into the area of activism, whether it's, whether you're sort of agitating within a major corporation or whether you're an assistant professor at some university. And we need a Thomas Paine. We need to have some Thomas Paine, who will call to action about the issues, particularly in the environment, and the condition of the human species, seen as now an issue of global food and land production, biodiversity saving, and all that stuff, so that you're not getting picked off one by the sniper fire from hired corporate spokesmen. You have something that would unite you. Ma'am.
That's what I was going to comment, is I feel like there are positions that have risen up and have had these loud moments of making an issue well known, but there isn't a unifying underlying, for lack of a better word, cause that draws all these movements together. And so I think that is true, that we need something that can be, expressed by all these different groups of people who are passionate about these issues, and finding that underlying message that people can rally around. I feel like that's one thing that we don't have at this point. We haven't figured something like that out.
No. You know, it's curious, we haven't had political candidates, you know, honest, straight-speaking political candidates who talk like that. You were saying?
I just said, I feel like that message could easily be environmentalism. We're tying all these things back to that, and that could easily be the underlying
Do you think that has
message.
a future?
But presenting that message causes
No, I
so
mean,
much
what do you
controversy,
think the
so
future
many
is? Do you think environment is going to be the next big thing?
No.
I mean, it's big now, but is it going to become such an overriding issue that people really talk about it instead of the Super Bowl?
I was going to say, I'd like to think so, but to make your comparison with the Vietnam War, I mean, I think that had a lot of internal motivation for people, especially, I mean, if you're a man who's going to be drafted into a war you didn't support, you have a lot of incentive to demonstrate against that. And while I think a lot of us consider environmental issues very important, I don't think that the general public has that same incentive that you would have if you had a fear of getting drafted, or your brother getting drafted, or someone in your family.
Yeah.
So I don't think that we have that kind of internal motivation.
Environmentalism is sort of left-wing, isn't it?
Well,
I mean, it's seen that way? I'm sorry.
I don't think it's just that. I think that you absolutely hit on it, that it's a different kind of rallying that you have to do when you're not rallying around a single phenomenon that directly impacts people in a very physical way. It's a lot more difficult to rally people around abstract concepts. And I think that you still see the traditional kind of rallying and demonstrations and marches, etc., when it's an immediate visceral issue, like you saw with Trayvon Martin's shooting or something like that.
Yeah.
But I think that when these are larger societal issues, I think that for our generation, we take a little bit more of a, I guess, in some ways subtle, but in other ways rather audacious tactic of just sort of undermining existing power structures. I think that the approach in the past was to try to change an existing power structure. And I think that for our generation, we just ask why we need it at all. And I think that the internet has been really, really useful in democratizing knowledge and democratizing the way that people can respond to things and can react to things and can make changes in their individual lives. So I think you see movement and
you
dynamism,
see,
which is not the
again,
same.
sort of like the population growth phenomenon, you see already built in. As something that hasn't come up at all. The internet, the global web, as something that automatically is going to start achieving these activist goals that we've been talking about.
In some ways, yeah.
Right. Others have expressed that opinion, and I hope that it's right. Correct. Yeah.
I hope so too.
Let's see. I want to get somebody ever different. Oh, what about down the end of the table there? There's I think there's a group of resistors down there. Okay, go ahead. You open your mouth. Talk.
not as a resistant, but my question and how this thing that I'm about to bring up fits into all of this is, at least in America, I feel that there's a huge attack on science and data, and how we, the general American public is taught about what science means and how it does. So I'm just curious, I'd like to talk about, like, how do we, and is it just a matter of education? Because I think we keep using that term to say, oh, it's just education. But, as a former science teacher, and I guess still a current science teacher.
Well, you mentioned, excuse me for interrupting you, but you did mention science, understanding of science by the public. And you're a teacher. You want to elaborate about that?
Well, I think part of the issue is like that there is a and this would even come with my students. I think there's the way that science gets taught, and especially in a lot of this like recent standards-based stuff is very there's right and wrong answers, and so students don't really think about like what scientists do and how knowledge evolves in science. And so I think that you know, for example, with climate change, the immediate tactic is to go towards a scientist who had, you know, some bad dealing, so to speak, and say, okay, so all scientists are like that. And then that gets popularized and people don't understand what's going on in the issues. So it's like, how do we combat that?
Right. Now, let me mention something you know anyway. 40% of Americans are evangelical Christians. They and a substantial group in other groups, a few Roman Catholics still and so on, believe in creationism. They do not believe that evolution has ever occurred. And do you think that's a factor in our American resistance to better science teaching and understanding?
I think in some sense it is. I don't know if that's the only.
What?
I think in some sense it might be, but I don't think that's the only issue.
You're too easygoing.
Yeah, no.
You should either,
I mean,
you should either deny that or.
I must say something. Like
Yeah.
there was a comment that got made about Texas. I grew up in Texas. I went to a Texas high school. I didn't learn about creationism, at least in my science class, my biology classes. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but I'm saying that I think it's a deeper issue than just like evangelism versus non-evangelism, or, you know, like a creationism versus evolution. I think, yes, that is an issue that is in science for sure, but I think a deeper issue is that students misunderstand how science is done.
Yeah.
And I think that is the bottom line.
You know, I don't entirely agree with you, even though I've written books on it. But let's hear another view or a reinforcement. Go
I
ahead.
just have a comment based on what Chris said, and that's about trust and how the public views science and scientists. And I've seen it written that some time ago, you know, where the public put their trust was like firefighter, physician, scientist, police officer. And now, and I'm not sure why this happened or how it came about, but scientist has like dropped way off the list. The public just doesn't trust that scientists are doing what they're doing well
think that's
and
the case?
truthfully.
Yes.
Is that
Well-
borne out by surveys?
Yeah.
Or is that your impression? Okay, well, I wasn't aware of that part myself.
Yeah.
I
And I
guess
think
I've been
you see
walking
that.
around in a cloud. I don't know.
Well, I think you see that with things like climate change, where
Yeah.
people are so eager to expose any sort of error that scientists may have made and suggest that it wasn't an error of science, but it was an error of the people who do science having acted immorally.
Or not realizing that error is a part of what we have to deal with in
Yeah,
science.
okay. How many, who here will say, I'm not asking for a disagreement, but I want to hear both sides. Is there anybody that would disagree with that assessment?
I'd like to add something to it a little bit. Being a teacher and being a scientist before I was a teacher, and listening to my children every day, and I have children in my class every year that are aspiring scientists. They want to be a scientist, and the children that it comes to freedom of expression. It also comes to the standards that are put out there. That there are so many standards now that these children, there's so many hurdles that these children have to jump over, that it becomes a time issue.
Excuse me, you're not getting to the subject here.
Okay, I was thinking I was, but I was thinking it gets down to the morality, the deeper values that we all carry into the classroom, and that it is a moral issue. And
How
certainly
so?
I think religion does play a part, like you say, in the country, but I have parents who come in and talk about, I don't want my child to learn this subject of evolution that I teach them because of their religious beliefs. And
What I'm hearing from the teachers then is maybe, especially if some of the testimonies coming from Texas, that maybe this isn't as serious a problem as it's purported to be. Is that what I'm hearing from people with teaching experience? That's not the main reason that science is having difficulty in public eyes. Well, one thing I can tell you, I want to hear from you, but wait a minute, one thing I can tell you is we scientists are invisible. The only way you get visibility in science is to become a popularizer, you know, like Richard Dawkins or Stephen Jay Gould. And usually they are self-promoters with a real political twist to what their writing is. But the public knows who they are because they get pop star attention through their writings and appearance in television and so on. Most people cannot name a single scientist, living scientist.
Would you put yourself in that category? Would you put yourself in that category?
What, you mean popularizer?
Yeah.
I went into popularization after I'd won the National Medal of Science. In other words, these guys went in immediately. Okay. We were going to.
I mean, that was essentially exactly what I was going to comment, is that a lot of people just have never interacted with a scientist who's not someone who has been featured on Good Morning America or things like this, where popularized science. And also, I was reading a study recently, I can't remember where it came from, but it was people choosing words that they would describe scientists with, and it was things like authoritative and basically not empathetic, not social, not going. So basically these ideas about scientists that we do our work, we don't share it with anybody, we don't talk to anybody, we only mingle with scientists, which is in part true. I mean, we touched on this last time when Alex was bringing up the idea that we have no scientists in a lot of public offices. Like, I think that that's part of the issue, is people just don't interact with scientists other than these popularized people. And I don't know exactly how we broach that, but...
Yeah, well, it's a very confused issue here. And I guess that just a side comment that a few years ago I decided that if we could recruit particularly the Christian community, the creationists, and who I thought might have a potential passion for the environment, God's creation, could become a powerful force. I wrote a book called The Creation, and was pleased that it did cause quite a stir in the evangelical community. I held retreats. I went to, I was invited to conferences and churches, and I'm looking at a fellow Alabamian right now. I was invited by Sanford University, which is called the Ivy League of the Southern Baptist Convention, to be a guest and so on. And I met with the Mormon leadership in the president's office, and things like that. And there actually was a stir. I think there were groups of evangelicals who had already formed things like the Green Cross, and an organization that wanted to be environmental for the right reasons. Well, they also because they thought this was God's will. And so there was even a split due to this in the evangelical religion between extreme dispensationalists like Falwell, who believe that there's only that the second coming is imminent. You surely hear a lot of that in North Carolina. That it's imminent, and therefore you're wasting your time trying to take care of all these plants, animals, and anything else. The only important thing, the extreme group said, is to convert souls, to save souls so that they can join when the second coming occurs. It's momentary. That group split from what you might call moderate evangelicals, who were the majority, and there was some hard feelings for a while, and a couple of people lost their jobs in the Southern Baptist Convention and all that stuff. But then it settled down, and things had, it didn't make a great deal of change. I just mentioned this for interest, that I do see barriers there toward general acceptance of the scientific method. And we really need to somehow not inculcate, God forbid I use that word, that we need somehow to make familiar as, a cultural, a property of our culture that's very powerful and helpful and illuminating as a scientific method. And we aren't not doing that, are we? Next.
Well, I think that science teachers, and I'll speak for myself, try to do that. However, I feel that the way a lot of the standards, the standards, which is what we have to teach, are written, are not in that, in that philosophy. In other words, I have to teach students a lot of particular facts about science, and whereas I want to do as much as I can, or when I was teaching, to actually get into the guts of like doing science in terms of the scientific method, a lot of times I was spending a lot of time doing just a litany of these standards to teach students about other things.
Yeah.
So,
my impression has been that there are archetypes that people resonate to, and particularly young people. And these archetypes include the Grail, the search for the Grail, the search for a new land, for a distant and unknown island, and the adventures that await thereupon, and so on. And that somehow we ought to, if we can present science more with reference to the archetypes of discovery, and then show how it's done as part of drama, then that might be sort of a maneuver that brings science to the attention of others. I've had this thought many times, and before we take a break, we have a couple minutes. I thought I'd just tell you a story. Or a couple quick about this. I recently met Jim Cameron, Avatar. He's planning a follow-up of 2 more. And that's the kind of amazing, fantastic adventure, science fiction, fantasy, which nevertheless has a powerful environmental message, of a beleaguered people in harmony with nature who are getting pushed aside by corporate armies, heavily armed, and so on. You know the story. You've all seen Avatar. If you haven't, you should, at least on television. But the other story involves the Jurassic Park, and there is some really good science that what's his name? Who's the author of Jurassic? What?
Michael Crichton.
Michael Crichton. Yeah. At any rate, he gave us some good science there. This ingenious idea of extracting DNA from the blood of a dinosaur that could be separated could be found, I should say, in an amber specimen of mosquitoes that had fed on dinosaurs. You could get them with their bellies full of blood. Then you could extract that, and you could get the DNA and the genome of a dinosaur, and you just might be able to create a dinosaur. And that's maybe it turns out that that's impossible, but it's not incomprehensible. And just reasoning that way, coming at a problem or a phenomenon or potential new discovery in a wholly different direction is a good feature of science. And we have lots of adventure stories like that. Well, at any rate, I had dinner with Michael Crichton once, and we started talking. He was particularly interested in hearing how I'd survived the big sociobiology controversy in which I dared in the 70s to suggest that human behavior is not all a blank slate, that we have some instincts. That was bitterly resisted. And he wanted to know what my feelings were about that, because he was under fire because of a book and then the movie Rising Sun, in which the Japanese were portrayed as wanting to conquer the world now with commerce. They failed once, in the Second World War to do it in the military. They're going to do it by commerce. That's a sudden in the background of the rising sun as fiction. Well, that was the reason that we got together. So I then told him a story. I've worked with amber and lots and lots of amber containing ants going all the way back to the beginning of the Cenozoic, 65 million years ago, to track the evolution of the ants. They're really abundant in the ants, amber, and you can do that. Then we've been getting hold of ants before the Cenozoic and into the age of dinosaurs. But basically, what I didn't want to say that I was going to create some Cretaceous ant. However, I did say I had actually considered the following experiment, and it would be, I had blocks of amber that were about 30 million years old, in which there were masses of ants that had been captured as a whole colony, so there were lots of them. I had worked out the code of ants earlier, the pheromones by which ants generally communicate by 10 to 20 signals, a very complicated, sophisticated code with even things like grammar and context when they're communicating. So one of the things I knew that you could get easily from any ant, maybe even a fossil, is alarm substance. These are terpenoids usually that preserve well, and you can take, and they also work across species. At any rate, here I had these ants, about 30 million years old, from the Dominican Republic. I knew what they were. I knew what their direct descendant likely was in the rainforest of South America at the present time. I knew I could culture those. I could get those and have them in the lab, the living descendant. So I thought it might be possible I could do it. I just know I could do it. If there's any terpenoid left in those mass of ants, we could extract that. Then I could take that alarm pheromone and try it out on the descendants of 30 million years later and deliver a message across 30 million years. Boy, he loved that. And he said, "Did you do it?" And I said, "No, because it's just a circus trick." And therein lies a lesson about doing science. This would have been a circus trick, but it would have been no great advance in science for me to give evidence that they still had a pheromone now that they had 30 million years ago. It sure would have made the newspapers. I never got around to doing it. I just thought I'd tell you that story about science. At any rate, I'm going to stop for 5 minutes.